In this lesson we're talking about finding the extremes in our painting. So when we block in, we don't want to think in terms of finding subtle values and subtle color changes. Go for the extremes. Go for the two main values in the dark and light that really suggest the light. Too often we want to see subtleties first, but go for those extreme values and then spend more time on subtlety and detail, but always a little less than you think.
Today we're going to look at finding the extremes in your painting, or when you're painting using a reference or outside. Look for the extreme shapes of contrast, strongest dark and light. So I'm insinuating by saying we have to find it that we usually don't, and myself is included in that we tend to look for subtleties. When we look at a scene, and camera is a big part of that, we tend to look at, like in the shadows here, we see the subtle color variations, subtle value variations, and we don't see the big overall dark and light shapes that give us the strong contrast. So seeing the subtleties first, we always lose the sense of light. And part of that subtlety is the drawing. We get caught up in the drawing of things, whether it's trees, houses, whatever it is, and we don't get caught up in the big shape and the extreme contrasts. So this is a painting by Carl Moll, M-O-L-L. He was an Austrian painter, early 20th century. He really simplified well. He found the extremes of, in this case, shadow and sunlight that really suggest the light. Now there's subtleties in the big areas, but he found this color, or one of these dark greens first. Probably not the darkest green, it doesn't look like. And then same thing with the lights. One overall light, one overall dark. And spending more time, I think, getting the relationships right between those extremes. Then going in and breaking it up, looking for subtle color, subtle value change. Because there's a lot of subtle change, like in this shadow in here. 4 or 5 different colors. A subtle, at least 2 or 3 values within the shadow. But you have to start with the extreme first, because if you don't capture the light. And then all the subtlety in the world's not going to help at all. And this image that he painted, it looks like it was fairly easy to see the extremes, but maybe not. Maybe there was more value change in the shadows, more value change in the lights in here, and he just simplified it. And that's part of it also, being able to simplify what we're looking at. This is another one of his. When we talk about shadow pattern, this is, of course, somewhat really emphasizing on the shadow pattern, but getting the extremes between the shadow pattern and the sunlit or sunlit pattern. All the way back to the background, looking for those extremes, not the subtle value changes or the close value changes. Always look for the extremes first. And these two paintings by Carl Moll are kind of obvious, it looks like, with the extremes. But it's only obvious to us because he's picking the extremes and really pushing it. He's making this, designing this dark shape of this foliage in the shadow here on the ground to really contrast the lights. And he's pushing the extreme, going, darkest to lightest almost, although probably leaving out the darkest accent first. But finding that extremes with the large darks and lights. And then when you break it up, color variation, value variation, it's not a lot. Too much variation or subtle changes in the extremes can really kill it. And the more you push the extremes, the more you realize how far you can go in the subtleties before you just ruin that contrast. And that's what we want to look for. This is a Russian painter. This is more of a block-in. I'm assuming it's outside, a little older. But you can see there wasn't much time spent on breaking up the big shapes. And when he does block in the big shapes, it's more the extreme values. Everything in the snow or in the grass area or dirt area, that's about the lightest. Everything else is dark compared to the snow, compared to the sky. So pushing those extreme shapes. Now when you want to push the extremes, it helps to being able to simplify the shapes first. If I'm seeing too much detail, I can't simplify, and it's a lot harder to push the extreme contrast between the dark and light. But he really has a nice shape here for the tree. These bare trees, when he's looking at it, it's probably billions of little branches, but he's able to see it as a solid mass. And everything in the ground here is either this warm reddish orange or the real light violet of the snow. There's no subtlety anywhere until you get down in here. Everything's very, very contrasty, very separated value-wise. And that's what we want to do. We really want to push those extremes. So it's not always that easy. The paintings we looked at, they really kept the darks and lights simple in the painting. Here we have a painting where the light's a little bit flatter. It's more towards midday in the Tetons. There's not a lot of big shadow pattern. There is definite shadow pattern in here that we can certainly simplify and push the extreme between the kind of an overall dark and overall light. But then we have a lot of subtlety between the vertical trees and the flat ground. But I want to push that also, so that when I block in the painting, it's more like this. I want an overall light down here that's really going to contrast the trees. And we're not talking shadow pattern, we're just talking separating the planes. So the slanted plane of the mountains, vertical plane of the trees, the flat plane of the grass. Really separating that a lot more than maybe what the photograph gives you. Or being able to find the right value in each plane that's going to give you that strong separation. And too often we see the subtlety too much. So I can look at this and pick, for the light value on the ground, I might want to go with that value right there. And then for the light trees, I might want to stick with a little bit darker in here. And if I use those two to block it in, I'm going to get one value here in the light trees, one value in the ground, fill it in, and I'm going to get that separation. Now I can come back with the subtleties and get more halftones in here and more lights in here, as well as creating that dark pattern, that shadow pattern. But I really have to separate with more extreme contrast the planes to make the painting read as it should. Not necessarily as the photograph gives me. Simplifying those big shapes and pushing the extreme. And if I don't see it in the photograph, I know the light is real strong, and I know the more I push the dark and light, the more I'm going to get that contrast and achieve the sense of light I see. And one of the problems in doing this, finding the extremes, is sometimes we go too dark on the darks or too light in the light areas. But you're able to catch that. You can tell when you're getting chalky. You might have to get there first. Make those mistakes of going too light or too dark. But that's better than not ever going dark enough or light enough, not getting that contrast. So if you're going to err when you look for the extremes, err on getting too much contrast, because it's a little easier to back off once you get too much than it is to try and work with subtlety first. The subtlety can always be added, but you want to establish that big contrast first. Now this is in Tucson, kind of up in the mountains a little bit. And you can sense the light coming from in front of the viewer, a little very much to the left. The light's back in here, just out of sight, very extreme, it's in front. So the first thing I want to do is find those patterns of dark and get this value and that value. Get those extremes in there. And of course, one value there for the water, one value for the background. I tend to go, if I see mostly shadow in the mountains, I'll start with that shadow value. If I see mostly light, I'll start with the lighter value. It's not a big jump in contrast in the background. The further back you go, the less contrast there is. So you can see it in these mountains, the contrast between dark and light back in here. Here's the light right here, and there's the dark. Not a lot of contrast there. So I want to start with whichever one dominates and then add a little bit of the other value. But really keep them separate up front and force yourself to see the difference. I'm going to ignore the small value changes, and I'm going to ignore the subtle value and color changes and go for the extremes. We can find the extremes sometimes in these photographs like this. Like right here, it's real strong. Extreme value contrast. Same thing here, the tree and the darker background. Pretty strong. But within the shadow, there is a subtle or a ton of little subtle variations that can really throw you off and you lose your contrast. So keep it simple in mind like this. Then as you break it up, this one overall value in color will keep you from getting too subtle. Get away from your strong contrast in there. So last one here is a snow scene. And in the snow area, it's a little easier. You can see that definite simple light value in the snow and the shadow value. Here's where it gets more complicated. And that's where I want to simplify more. Just mass it together. Just lose those little darks and lights, especially in the drawing stage. If I can pull this together in the drawing like this, just like we've talked about finding the shadow pattern, that's all we're doing here. And then as I add color, I'm keeping this pattern as much as possible. A lot more than what the photograph gives me. Way too light in these shadows in here. I want to create a darker pattern just like Mr. Mole did here. Kept these darks pretty strong, pretty dark, and the light's light enough that those extremes really create the sense of light that's in there. And then on a cloudy day or a day where the light's a little flat, we really push the separation of the planes more to create that sense of contrast. So you're painting what you see, but you're also applying what you know to create more depth and more shape and more sense of light. And it's a good way to find out too where you're lacking. It's kind of like using a black and white photograph to paint from to see what you know about color. And if you really struggle with getting any color down there at all, then you kind of realize where you're failing in your color. You're not able to get the darks right, or maybe the lights aren't right, or your contrast isn't right, and then it's more of a value problem. But take the photograph as a starting place and then apply what you know as well as what you see.